Hey folks, welcome back to the show. We have a different kind of episode today. Today is a solo episode with just me, kind of going back to my roots. The reason why I started this podcast way back, if any of you guys have heard any of the podcasts I've been interviewed on, I really started this podcast 5 years ago now because I became fascinated with peptides. And I was trying to figure out at the time, well, how am I going to get anybody to talk to me who knows more than me about peptides? And myself and a business coach I had at the time had this brilliant idea to start a podcast. And so I did. And as they say, the rest is history. So for those of you who do not know what a peptide is, who have no idea what I'm talking about, who might be thinking that I'm talking about collagen peptides that you might put into your coffee for better skin, hair, and nails, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what peptides are. I'm going to refer to a couple of other episodes I've done on peptides, and then I'm going to dive into a peptide called KPV, which is a really, really interesting tiny peptide or small molecule. So what are peptides? Peptides are small proteins, and they are tiny proteins that are natural to the body. They naturally occur in our bodies. Very often, they are fragments of bigger proteins. And what distinguishes these fragments is that there are receptors in the body. There's channels for them, specific channel transporters for them to get into cells where they're able to initiate different types of chemical cascades that will bring you a certain outcome. So I did an episode similar to this one on BPC 157. That is probably one of the best known healing peptides out there. It's definitely becoming much more mainstream. The episode I recorded on that one is 218. So I'm not going to spend time talking about BPC here because, well, it's fascinating. Everybody wants to hear about it. Everybody wants to know about it. But I'm going to direct you back to that episode because if I start talking about BPC, we're never going to get to KPV. The other one that I have talked about and did a solo episode on is GHK-Cu. It is also a repair peptide. It is also anti-inflammatory, and its superpower is that it is really powerful for skin. It also upregulates collagen and elastin. It actually flips over 1,000 genes in the human genome back to their more useful state or settings. And so that GHK-Cu deep dive is episode 248. So you might want to go back to that episode to learn about that. But today we're going to talk about KPV. Now, a couple more basics about peptides before we dive in case you're brand new to this space, is that peptides, like I said, are tiny proteins. They're generally speaking under 50 amino acids or less. Some people might say they're 100 amino acids or less. Depends on who you're talking to. Regardless, they're small. And today, you could not call KPV anything other than a peptide because it's only 3 amino acids. So it is actually part of a larger peptide that is naturally occurring in the body called Melanotan. Now, Melanotan is an interesting peptide. Some people have heard of it, particularly in the bodybuilding community, because it is a compound that when it is administered to the body will bring up the expression of your melanin. And melanin is what gives your skin pigmentation, which means in plain English, it can help you to look awfully tanned with very little to no sun. So melanotan is an interesting compound in and of itself. We're not going to talk about it today because it's a whole other deep dive, but KPV is actually a terminal sequence that's found on melanotan that when it's cleaved off, no longer activates melanocytes, so it doesn't make people tan, but it's retained some really interesting and very powerful properties that can also be expressed by melanotan. But once you kind of isolate the KPV and give that on its own back to the body, we start to see very emphasized effects that you wouldn't necessarily notice as much with melanotan because melanotan's bigger. It's doing many different things. So KPV, like I said, tiny tripeptide. It's only 3 amino acids. It's lysine, proline, and valine. Now, don't go thinking you can just go out and buy a bunch of lysine, proline, and valine, and it will magically reassemble into KPV in your body. These 3 amino acids are assembled and put together in a very specific configuration that allows them to act and do what they do in the body. So like I said, you won't get a tan from KPV, but what you will potentially experience, or what has been observed in clinical trials, certainly mostly which have been done on mice, unfortunately, but we have more and more data coming out on humans, that KPV is very anti-inflammatory and also has healing effects. So it's got a variety of different applications. So how does it work, right? So does KPV act on your DNA like a bioregulator might? Nope, it does not do that. What KPV does is it uses a very specialized transporter called PepT1, which is extremely abundant. And this is going to give us an idea of where it's going to work its magic. That transporter is especially abundant in the gut, and it's also expressed by tissues that are suffering from inflammation. So that means that KPV gets to be delivered exactly where it's intended, whether it's in the lining of the intestine or on the surface of the skin. So what it really does is once it's inside the cell, KPV acts on two major inflammatory pathways. And I'm going to get a little technical here, but stay with me. All you have to remember is that it helps to tone down inflammation. For those of you who are a little bit more on the nerd side, and I say that with love because I myself consider myself a nerd, it acts on NF-kappa B pathway, which is a master switch for inflammation. And what KPV does is it blocks the movement of this NF-kappa B into the cell nucleus. And that means that you end up getting a reduction in the production of key inflammatory molecules like TNF-alpha, IL-6, and IL-8. So you don't have to remember the names of all these things. All you really need to know is that one of the ways that KPV works is it actually blocks the entry of inflammatory causing compounds into the cell. And so that in and of itself reduces the amount of other inflammatory molecules that are produced by the cell. Net, we turn down the inflammation. Now, we've all heard that inflammation is not our friend when it comes to having optimal health, and certainly not as we are aging. Now, the other pathway that is impacted by KPV is MAPK. Now, it also dials this pathway down, even further reducing the cell's inflammatory response. Now, what's truly, truly remarkable is that KPV does all this without activating the melanocortin receptors, which means that you don't get that crazy tan. Now, some of you may be sitting there going, well, wait a minute, I want a tan and I don't want to sit in the sun because my skin gets damaged. So true. And that's why many people have experimented with Melanotan, and a lot of people still do use it. The only thing I'll say about Melanotan is it's still a little bit controversial. There's some questions about could there be some kind of a link between using Melanotan and possibly increasing the risk of melanomas or skin cancer because you're overactivating these melanocytes. Maybe if there's already an underlying problem or DNA damage. So I'm not saying it does. I'm just saying that there's some question about it, and KPV completely bypasses that because it has no effect on the melanocytes. Okay. So now what are the other benefits of KPV? Because it's not just a one-trick monkey. Very few peptides are. So number one, we've got the anti-inflammatory action. Now in animal models, it worked really nicely for colitis, in which it reduced inflammatory markers by up to 80%. So we're going to talk a little bit about where people can buy KPV to try. It is offered as capsules. So there are a couple of supplement manufacturers that include KPV either on its own or in conjunction with BPC 157, which is really interesting because BPC 157 is a repair peptide, also has anti-inflammatory properties. When we stack it with something like KPV, we get an increase. And we know the BPC 157 is very powerful for the gut. And now we have two things that are powerful for the gut, both of which are anti-inflammatory, one of which also stimulates repair. So it would seem that in inflammatory bowel diseases, there might be a really interesting application here. So in those animal models of colitis, the KPV reduced inflammatory markers by up to 80%. Now, here's another really cool thing that KPV can help with. It is antimicrobial. And so KPV can help the immune system fight off bacteria like Staphylococcus aureus and fungi like Candida albicans. Now, I don't know how many of you guys have heard about Candida. Now, first of all, staph, big deal. But Candida is one of those yeasts that is naturally occurring in the body, but quite often in certain states of imbalances, people can experience a candida overgrowth. And when that happens, it can express as thrush in the mouth. It can express as yeast infections in women and vaginal yeast infections, but also you can also have systemic issues with candida overgrowth. So typically to control candida, people are put on very restrictive diets, which it may be necessary for some people to follow one of these restrictive diets where there's like no carbs, no sugar, no fermented foods, even no mushrooms, like nothing, none of those things. And they may have to take antifungal agents. Now the antifungal agents, they're drugs, and like everything else, good news, bad news, sometimes you need them. But what if you could use something like KPV that doesn't seem to have much in the way of side effects at all instead? And it's something that your body naturally produces. What you're doing is you're bringing in a therapeutic dose at a much higher dosage to try and help to rebalance stuff. So that would be an interesting application. Another interesting effect of KPV is accelerated healing. So this is why, are you starting to get the idea why BPC 157 and KPV might actually be really good buddies? We often talk about BPC 157 working really well with thymosin beta 4 as a repair peptide. But here we have BPC 157 also partnering really nicely with KPV. So studies have shown that KPV speeds up mucosal gut lining. So that's the lining of your gut is covered in mucosa. And very often that gut lining of the gut, as many of you know, can get damaged. Well, it turns out that KPV can actually be really helpful at speeding up the healing of that mucosal lining, as well as skin repair, making wounds close faster and with less scarring. What's the other peptide that does that? Oh, GHK. So BPC 157, GHK, KPV all seem to be able to access and impact these mechanisms through different pathways. And we always know, like, the more pathways we can activate towards a common goal, very often the more powerful our modality is going to be, our treatment's going to be. Now, here's another one, immune modulation. Now, many of you, again, will know that the immune system can either be overactive or underactive. The secret to good immunity is having a balanced immune system. So we want modulation, not boosting, not suppression. Now, in some cases, we might want suppression or we might want boosting. That's a medical thing. For example, we have steroids or immunosuppressants. They are sometimes necessary in certain medical conditions, but there's a price to be paid there. And unless somebody really, really needs them, it's a great idea to try and find another way of dealing with the issue. Now, again, medically, this is not medical advice, number one. And number two, medically, if you actually need these compounds, then don't be crazy. You might have to use them for a while. But something like KPV is showing promise at maybe being able to assist or be an alternative in certain instances. So KPV balances the immune response without shutting it down. So that means you're not getting that shut everything off and then leaving people kind of a sitting duck for the next bug that comes along, right? So it reduces the risk of contracting other infections or other complications that are often seen with things like steroids. So again, not bad-mouthing steroids, just saying that this might be an option in certain instances. Okay, what are the conditions that KPV is showing promise in these mouse studies? So number one, inflammatory bowel disease. I mentioned earlier, so this is where KPV really stands out. We've got mouse models of colitis, oral KPV. So this is orally delivered in capsules. So we have access to these. It dramatically reduced gut inflammation. It dramatically promoted healing and improved overall health. Now, the human trials are coming, and so far, the results are very encouraging. From an anecdotal perspective, I can tell you that I've definitely heard back from members in my communities who have used KPV, who really like it, who really feel that it's extremely helpful. And the nice thing about things like KPV is they tend to not interact negatively with medications. Now, if you're on medications, you've got to speak to your doctor. You've got to be upfront and say, look, I read about this. You can bring them some research. There'll be some references to articles in the show notes. And you may want to bring those articles to your medical doctor and explore whether or not something like KPV can work for you alongside your medication. You don't need me to tell you that colitis is a serious condition. And the last thing anybody wants is to stop a medication to try some new thing. And what if the new thing doesn't work and you go into a flare, and it could be weeks and months before you can get things back under control. So do not take this lightly. I see it way too often. People think that peptides are a free pass because they're naturally occurring in the body, and what could possibly go wrong, especially when you're dealing with a medical condition. Find yourself a physician, and there's a growing number of them out there who will be willing to work with you and figure out how to apply these things alongside your meds. And hopefully down the road, maybe titrate the meds down. Maybe you'll get to use less, or maybe you'll be able to replace the medication with something else. But until you can figure that out, you absolutely want to get medical guidance here. So number 2, skin conditions. Number 1 was the irritable bowel diseases. Number 2, skin condition. Now, this is where we would need a compounding pharmacy, most likely, because they've taken KPV and compounded it as a cream, like a topical cream. KPV has shown promise in treating acne, eczema, and even speeding up wound healing. Now, again, very often people will use topical steroids for these conditions. Unlike those, it doesn't thin the skin and it does not cause long-term side effects. Okay, number 3. Now here's a new one. I haven't even mentioned this yet. Neuroprotection. Wow, right? It can protect the brain. Early research suggests that KPV may protect the brain after traumatic injury by reducing inflammation and limiting tissue damage. So we know that in traumatic brain injury, one of the things that happens right away is you get inflammation in the brain, and that can be responsible for a lot of the damage and a lot of the ongoing issues with TBIs. So again, this is still in experimental stages, but it definitely opens up really exciting avenues for research for future therapies. So let's now talk a little bit about how is KPV administered. So KPV, super versatile, and it can be administered in different ways. And that's in part because it's a tiny little peptide, 3 amino acid chain, very kind of happy in its little triad. And you've got these specialized transporters mysteriously that exist in the body, waiting to bring them into the cells. So clearly it belongs in the human body. Now, in the research, they used hydrogels or nanoparticles that transported the KPV to the gut, making it ideal for IBD. But I can tell you that a couple of the supplement companies that I've worked with, and you guys have heard of them if you listen to this podcast at all, we have Level Up Health has KPV, I'm pretty sure, on its own. And we also have Healthgevity. And Healthgevity also has KPV. I believe they have a BPC KPV and PEA combo. I know that Level Up Health has KPV in their Ultimate GI Repair, which also includes the BPC 157, the GHK-Cu, lorazepam, such a powerful stack of ingredients that all collaborate to help with gut healing. So that's just 2 supplement companies off the top of my head. We have links and codes for both of those. Those will be in the show notes. And Level Up may even have KPV on its own. KPV is also very often partnered with PEA, which is another very interesting compound. It's actually an endocannabinoid, and it is really powerful for pain, inflammation, all the things. So that's why we will often find them together, and you'll find those in a stack with these guys. Okay. Once again, KPV in the gut, either delivered, if possible, as a hydrogel or nanoparticle, but even just the oral supplements, I've seen really great results with those. It can also be applied topically, as we said. So creams and ointments that target skin conditions directly. The fact that it's slightly antimicrobial certainly won't help either, because very often when you have a wound, you want something that's going to keep any kind of bugs at bay. And then finally, there is evidence that as an injectable, subcutaneous injections provide systemic effects for broader inflammatory conditions. Now, this is not as readily available for people who are doing experiments and using research lab products or products from compounding pharmacies. Now we're introducing something into the body by injection. So this is now going into different territory. So in that sense, I would definitely recommend that you're working with a practitioner and somebody who can really guide you here. Okay. But systemically, there's been some evidence there. And basically, when you're introducing something like this systemically, for example, in an injection, you're going to get a much broader effect. So not necessarily targeted on one place or another. Okay. Now, is it safe? So far, it's shown an excellent safety profile in animal studies and in early human use. I can tell you in the communities that I run, for the most part, KPV is extremely well tolerated. Haven't heard of too many issues there, but that's only anecdotal. That is not an official position. All right. So far, there's no reports of organ toxicity, definitely no tanning, no skin pigmentation, and no serious side effects. And unlike steroids, like we said earlier, it doesn't weaken the immune system. It doesn't cause tissue thinning. And, every once in a while, you'll find someone who might have a local histamine reaction or get a bit of digestive upset, but very, very rare. And like I said before, you can kind of sidestep that just by taking it orally. So there are definitely human clinical trials coming down the pipes here, especially for inflammatory bowel disease. KPV could really become a pillar in the treatment of chronic inflammation, autoimmune conditions, and even wound care. And researchers are also exploring, as they are with all the peptides, new delivery methods such as transdermal patches, combination therapies to really fuel kind of more of the benefits that we see. So the good news is KPV is targeted, it's effective, and it seems to be very, very safe. And I think that it's definitely, if you're someone who's suffering with any of these conditions that we talked about, it's definitely worth a talk with your practitioner to see if this could be something that could work for you. And it's definitely something to keep an eye out in research papers. And so I'm going to include some of the references that we accessed for this research of this podcast in the show notes. But I wanted to talk also a little bit about how, in general, people who are using peptides, whether they're using oral peptides or topical peptides or any other strategy of application, one of the things I see that really needs improvement is a way to track and measure. So there's two kinds of people in the world. We have the people who just kind of try different things on different days and try to remember what happened. Oh, was that on Wednesday when I used this one thing? And how much did I use last time? And how much water did I add to this vial? Like, people can be very loosey-goosey with their protocols when they're using peptides. Also, people forget, right? It's really hard to keep track of all the different compounds out there, what they do. So I'm a big proponent of tracking and measuring and keeping really, really good records. And that's any peptide. And frankly, any supplement, right? But in the peptide space, especially, we have people who have taken matters into their own hands. They're experimenting with a million different things. They're trying out different stuff. They're sometimes a little bit confused about what does what and this does what. And so I'm going to talk to you about something really exciting that I came across recently. That is a new app. It's not in the App Store. You would actually have to go get this app from these guys' website. It's going to be in the show notes. And the app is called Peptide Pro. And Peptide Pro is really, really interesting because this is like a one-stop app. Not only do they give you a calendar that you can now populate with your protocols, that includes how often you're using, what your dosage is, the time of day. It'll give you reminders of when to take your next dose of whatever it is. But on top of that, these guys have gone to the next level. They've created an encyclopedia of all the different peptides. I think there's 65 peptides in this encyclopedia. And so, like I've been talking about the BPC 157 and the GHK and the KPV, there's thymosin beta 4, thymosin alpha 1. There's all these different peptides. All of them are living in this encyclopedia with descriptions, with some indication of what is the early research shown on these different things. And then there's going to be some guidance even in there about what's been seen to work well together. Now, we all know that us kind of health optimizers / biohackers love to try different things. We like to think about, well, if this does this and that does that, what happens when I put them together? So like I said before, we have supplement companies like Level Up or Healthgevity who have done the work for us and created stacks. But sometimes we want to think about creating our own stacks. And in that respect, this app has embedded in it some information about some of the things that might partner really well together for different types of situations. So we have the calendar, we've got the encyclopedia, we've got the guide that gives us ideas on different stacks or different combinations of things for different situations. There are some protocols in there. You even have, on top of all this, there's a calculator. So the calculator helps you to do the math. It helps you to understand, how do I put this together? And then it helps you to understand, how much of this product do I need to buy in order to fulfill my 6, 8, 10, 4, whatever week protocol at whatever dose I'm using today. So it is actually one of the most powerful tools out there. And I think that what's also most important is it provides you with a beautifully organized log of what you've done. And then you can go in there, you can write in some notes, talk about how you're feeling with different effects. And now you no longer have to sit there scratching your head, trying to remember, okay, wait, what did I do last week that might have made me feel better? Why are my joints feeling better? Why are my joints feeling worse? What is it that I started doing X number of days ago? What if you could just go back into your app and go back and look and see what happened so many days ago? And on top of that, have it be this incredible resource of information for yourself. So it is the Peptide Pro app. I'm going to give you the URL. I'm also going to give you a code if you want to use it. You don't have to use the code. Obviously, you can just use the URL. What the code will do, and it is an affiliate code, of course, but what the code will do is it will give you 50% off your first month. And it's actually pretty affordable, even just to begin with. Okay, so for the Peptide Pro app, it's peptidepro.app. And your discount code is Nathalie50, Nathalie 50, and that'll give you 50% off your first month. So once again, just to recap, we have KPV, our peptide of the month, if you will, and KPV, anti-inflammatory, antimicrobial, bioavailable by orally, as well as transdermally for healing and for calming down skin issues. And finally, also can be applied systemically for systemic inflammation problems. And that, of course, is the subject of a lot more research as well. So we've got the Peptide Pro app, and then the supplement companies that I mentioned were leveluphealth.com. We have code NAT15 there, I believe, or NAT. It'll be in the show notes. And also we've got Healthgevity, which is healthgev.com. And the discount code there, I believe, also is NAT or NAT10. So all this will be in the show notes for you guys. Just imagine with this app that you never have to do peptide math again, that you never have to go on some forum and say, what's the peptide for? Even though we all know that we don't ask the question, what's the peptide for? We understand what is the issue we're trying to deal with. And then once we have understanding of that and what's driving it, then we can start to think about, is this an issue with inflammation? Is this an issue with the immune system? What is the issue that is driving this? And then we can start to think about what might be a way to address it. And is it possible that there is an approach that might include a peptide in that? So thank you so much for listening today. Let me know if this is way too deep in the weeds for you, or if you enjoy this type of content. I can always do some more solo episodes on these types of topics in the future. I just got really stoked about KPV because I think it's one of those compounds that doesn't get nearly enough attention, and also really excited about this app because the Peptide Pro app really, really hits the mark on so many of the pain points that I've seen people express in my Facebook community, which is well over 30,000 people now. And even in my membership community, which is much smaller, much tighter, and still people often are struggling with the same issues. So thanks so much for being here. Totally appreciate you guys. Leave us your comments. Tell us what you think. Send me your questions. Find me on Instagram at Nathalie Niddam. And also, if you want to sign up for the newsletter and or if you want to learn about the membership community, then definitely head on over to natniddam.com where you can find information about all those things. Thanks again for being here. Until next time.